Welcome to the Workflow podcast. Many, many moons ago, the Roman philosopher and statesman Seneca said that life is not short if you know how to use it. He added that people are frugal with their money, but not so their time, which is the one thing it is right to be stingy with, because time, unlike money, cannot be earned back once you've spent it. He was right. We waste so much of our time at work, to the detriment of our professional goals, our health, our personal relationships, and our experience of life. My name is Steve Glaveski, and I'm the founder of Innovation Accelerator Collective Campus and the author of several books and numerous Harvard Business Review articles on all things productivity and performance at work. My mission with this show is to help you unlock your potential to do more great work in far less time, whether you're working as part of a team or flying solo, and to set you up for a richer life. If you enjoy this show, please like, share, and or subscribe. And if you'd like to learn more about my work and connect with me online, visit steveglaveski.com. And now, on with the show. Hello, and welcome to our first episode on the foundations of high performance and productivity. Nowadays, there's so much talk out there about the one percenters, the productivity hack or the new tool, the shiny new tool, or perhaps the activated turmeric, which is going to boost your immune system and do all sorts of wonderful things for you. And of course, we should not neglect the one percenters, and we will definitely visit them at some point in the Workflow podcast series, life cycle, whatever you want to call it. At some point in time, we will definitely visit those topics. But underneath all of the one percenters, underneath the icing on the cake is the cake itself. And when it comes to our work, and when it comes to getting the absolute best out of ourselves, we need to ensure that we have these four ingredients, or at least two of these four ingredients. It's even better if we have three. It's even better if we have all four. Purpose, incentives, passion, and strengths alignment. Now, we will cover these four topics in separate episodes, and today we will be looking at purpose. But before we go there, aside from these four ingredients, we also want to ensure that we are as optimized as we can possibly get when it comes to our emotional and physical health, because that is obviously going to have a direct effect, a direct bearing on how we show up at our desks every single day, how much energy we bring to the table, how long we can work for, how much clarity of thought we bring, and everything that comes with that. But today, we're going to be focusing on purpose. So just for your reference, an easy way to remember the four ingredients I touched on is pips. You can think of, say, pips in a fruit. So that was purpose, incentives, passion, and strengths. So let's get into this. I mean, purpose is something that I suppose some of us might think of as being a little bit woo. If you're a left-brain thinker, you might say, oh yeah, purpose. I'm just here to make money. And that might be true. That may be your sole intention. But despite that, we should not discount the actual role that purpose plays when it comes to our performance, because it does play a very significant role. As we'll see today, the science does back this. Now, before we get into the science though, one of my favorite books of all time would have to be Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Now, if you're not familiar with who Marcus Aurelius is, he was the Roman philosopher-king who ruled about 1,900 years ago in ancient Rome. And while he was king of the Roman Empire, he kept a journal. And in that journal, the journal, I should say first, it was never meant for publication. It was found after his death, and it has since been turned into a book called Meditations. And it's full of insights and profound words of wisdom from someone in his position of power, becomes very evident very quickly that he shared many of the same struggles and suffered like many of us do, despite his lofty seat in the Roman Empire. But one thing he did say, or one thing he did write in that book, which has stuck with me throughout the years, is nothing should be done without purpose. Now, there is even generating an income from a job is a purpose. But today we're going to start looking at this from the perspective of the underlying purpose of the nature of the work itself. For example, if I work for, say, World Vision, then the purpose behind that work is ultimately to improve the lives of people in developing countries, people who don't have access to education, healthcare, food, shelter, and so on. That purpose is very, very clear. Purpose has also become a bit of a cult in the past few years. I guess this has been buoyed on by the work of people like Simon Sinek, who wrote the book Start With Why, people like Jay Shetty, I guess, who wrote a book called On Purpose. Just this notion of purpose is something that has, I guess, become a lot more prominent in our lives. And it doesn't take too much thinking to see why that is. If we go back to the start of the 20th century, most of us, not most of us, about 40% of Americans, for example, were working in agriculture. That number is 2% today. The rest of us are probably employed in a coal mine, in a factory, on an assembly line. The nature of our work was very difficult, very physically taxing. We'd work 12-hour days. We wouldn't get paid all that much. If you look at the statistics on literacy, healthcare, poverty at the start of the 20th century compared to what it is today, it's almost like we flipped the script. In most developed countries, something like 90% of people lived under the poverty line. That number is now less than 10%, and often much lower in many developed countries as well. Same goes for literacy, access to healthcare. Child mortality has come way down. All these statistics that you can find in books like Hans Rosling's Factfulness, or Steven Pinker's work on the same topic. And now that we have made our way up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we've satisfied our physiological and safety needs, we start to look for more purpose behind our work. We start to look for self-actualization, and the very top of Maslow's rung, Maslow's hierarchy rather, the very top rung, which is all about transcendence, self-transcendence, giving back. And this was something that was published after the initial hierarchy of needs. So it's like that additional level that Maslow alluded to much later in his work. And this is just normal. Once we satisfy those basic needs, of course, we start asking deeper questions. We start asking, what is the meaning of life? But we also start asking, what is the meaning of work? And so whether you work as part of a large team at a Fortune 500 company, or whether you work for yourself, or whether you're the leader of a small startup, whatever the case is, purpose can help you perform both as an individual and can help your team and your company perform. And this is more than just woo. This is starting to be backed by a growing body of science on the topic. So let's dig into the science on the purpose. Let's dig into the science on purpose at work and the link between purpose and performance. The first study I wanted to draw attention to is a 2016 Harvard study, which essentially looked at corporate purpose and its impact on financial performance. Now, in this particular study, the researchers found that organizations who scored high on purpose and management clarity, that is, they were very clear on where we're going and how we're going to get there, they demonstrated a superior stock market performance and return on assets. This is echoed by a book called Firms of Endearment, which was published back in 2007. Now, this particular book, the authors spent 10 years tracking a portfolio or an index of companies. Now, this index included 18 different purpose-led organizations, and they compared the performance of these organizations in terms of their return on equity against the S&P, the Standard & Poor 500 index for the same period of time, that same 10-year period. Now, it turns out that these 18 companies outperformed the S&P 500 by 9 percentage points. So the portfolio of companies, of purpose-led companies, generated a 13.1% return on equity, whereas the S&P 500 only generated about 4.12% for the same period of time. Furthermore, my old stomping ground, my old employer, Ernst & Young, EY's Beacon Institute conducted a study on purpose at work back in 2016. And they found that 85% of purpose-led companies actually showed positive growth for the 3-year time period that they studied. So that was 85% demonstrated positive growth versus just 58% of non-purpose-led companies. Now, whenever I'm looking at studies and science, like I tend to take some of these things with a grain of salt because one study on its own isn't enough to really trust in the conclusions. It's only when you have a body of independent studies all coming to similar conclusions where you can kind of rest your hat on it to some degree. Because as Richard Feynman, famous physicist, said, we can never be sure we're right. We can only be sure we're wrong. Science is all about falsifying hypotheses. And when it comes to the social sciences, we're obviously in the midst of a replication crisis where something like 50% of studies can't be replicated. So I just want to stress that. But the reason why I allude to multiple studies is to provide you with more confidence that what these studies say is actually true. There are myriad reasons why one individual study on its own is not enough to really trust in, but that's something that I'll explore in a separate episode. For today, I just want you to know that I am referencing multiple studies in order to give you more confidence in what I'm saying being more likely to be true than wrong. So that was the EY Beacon Institute study. Another study out of Northwestern on the power of purpose found that individuals engaged in meaningful work at purpose-driven organizations are more engaged, more committed, intrinsically motivated, and show greater involvement in organizational citizenship. Now, this piece on engagement is massive because at a typical organization, particularly a large organization, employee attrition, when an employee leaves an organization, that can cost up to about $50,000 per employee. Now, why is that? Well, when you account for the cost of recruitment, search, reconnaissance, onboarding that employee, training them, and then the lost productivity while we're finding someone new and upskilling them, that can add up very, very quickly to about $50,000 in a large firm. And in a small organization, it could be somewhere between $5,000 and $20,000. So the more engaged we can keep people, the more likely they are to stick around longer, and the less we're going to suffer the cost of employee attrition. In fact, a couple of studies also back what I'm saying here. Deloitte ran a study where they found that purpose-led companies have a 40% higher level of employee retention, and Gallup also ran a similar study. Now they put their number at they put that number at 67%, basically saying that purpose-led companies had a 67% higher rate of employee retention. Now, this also extends to employee acquisition or attraction, or just attracting top talent to your organization. I mean, if you have a clear purpose, particularly when it comes to millennials and Generation Z employees who tend to be more purpose-oriented, you're going to find it much easier to attract that talent to your organization. And one simple example of that I can think of in my own work was when my consultancy, Collective Campus, ran a legal tech accelerator program for the mid-tier firm Mills Oakley. This was back in 2017. Now, this ultimately positioned Mills Oakley as a more progressive, more innovative law firm. And some of the feedback we got after the fact was by the law firm was that they were experiencing a higher number and higher caliber of candidate applications from people who wanted to work for the firm. And oftentimes they cited the Mills Oakley Accelerator and the fact that the firm seemed to be more forward thinking than others as one of the reasons for these people wanting to work for the firm. So employee engagement is directly related to purpose, and it does boost your ability to attract top talent, but also decreases the likelihood that that talent is going to leave once they've joined your firm or your organization. So purpose is also intrinsically related to persistence. John Yakimovich, a Harvard Business School professor, basically says that when you focus on your purpose, you're aligning with your deepest values, you're relieving yourself of the expectation that the long slog will be nothing but rainbows and lollipops. Now, this also echoes one of my favorite quotes of all time from former US President Calvin Coolidge, who said that nothing in this world will take the place of persistence. Talent will not, genius will not, education will not. He said something along the lines of, the world is full of educated derelicts. And he has a point. It doesn't matter how good your idea is, how skilled you are, how good your team is. Chances are, if you're pursuing something difficult, if you're pursuing something worthwhile, it will be difficult and it will be fraught with setbacks. And unless you are resilient and willing to play the long game, you're more likely to give up and pursue lower hanging fruit elsewhere. We look at people like Elon Musk, for example, who is heralded for being one of the most iconic business leaders of the day, richest person in the world, on a quest to make humanity a multiplanetary species, on a quest to help reverse some of the damage that we've done to the climate through electric batteries or through electric cars and lithium and whatnot. But he came to the brink of ruin on multiple occasions, both with Tesla and with SpaceX, with his Falcon rockets blowing up on multiple occasions before finally getting them to orbit. So persistence is absolutely key. And when you have a purpose behind your work, you're more likely to persist and play the long game. Interestingly enough, purpose has also been linked with death, with one study finding that purpose-led companies, or employees of purpose-led companies rather, have a 15% lower risk of death, which, if you think about it, kind of makes sense because there's a lot of literature out there about the elderly. When the elderly stop working, when they lose that sense of purpose and contribution to the world, their likelihood of developing depression and dying goes up quite significantly. So it stands to reason that when we don't have that purpose in our work, we could also suffer some deleterious consequences in terms of our physical health. Now, purpose alone isn't enough. You could be a purpose-led company, and I know a lot of people who work for not-for-profits who have a very compelling purpose, but these people find themselves spending all day in back-to-back meetings. They find that if they want to get something done, they need to get multiple approvals. That could take weeks, perhaps it could take months. And they just don't really feel that connection between their efforts and the outcomes of their organizations. And when you're not combining purpose with some sense of autonomy and control, that purpose can quickly be lost on people. So autonomy and control is key, but so is recognition, incentivization, income, these other variables that influence how we show up in a day-to-day basis. Now, this echoes what Dan Pink wrote about in his book Drive, which is all about the science of human motivation, in which he found that aside from extrinsic motivators such as money and recognition, what really motivates us is purpose, mastery, so learning, growing, getting better, and autonomy. Now, this autonomy piece is key, and it's one of the reasons why companies like Amazon and Netflix have a huge advantage over everybody else, is because they've built cultures based on conviction, on empowering people to make decisions and take action. When you do that, they can move much faster than their competitors who may still be operating not on conviction, but on centralization, on consensus seeking. And when you do that, you spend a lot of time in meetings, you spend a lot of time moving paper around, and not much time achieving outcomes. And when you're not seeing that feedback loop, a short feedback loop between your action and outcome, you end up with a long feedback loop. And that can be incredibly demoralizing for anybody. Not only is it demoralizing, but the rate at which you learn is much, much slower. So your decisions also suffer. And on that point, when it comes to feedback loops, there's a great story out of the Korean War where the American fighter pilots flew F-85 jets, whereas the Korean fighter pilots, the North Korean fighter pilots, flew Russian or Soviet issue MiGs. Now, on paper, the MiGs were far superior to the F-85s, but there were two key differences. One, the F-85 had a 360-degree bubble canopy, whereas the MiG had restricted view. Two, the F-85 had a fully hydraulic throttle, whereas the MiG had a semi-hydraulic throttle, which meant that Korean pilots had to lift weights to be able to pull the throttle back. Now, these two factors gave the American pilots two key advantages, which were one, better visibility, two, better maneuverability or adaptability. So they could see, they could observe, they could orient themselves faster, they could decide and act faster. And as a result of this, this was one of the key contributing factors to the Americans winning the battle in the skies 10-1. So it's not enough to simply be a purpose-led organization. You need to ensure that that feedback loop is short. And one way you do that is by empowering your people to make decisions. Because ultimately, why are we hiring people if we don't believe that they can make good decisions, if we're just going to bog them down in process, policy, and bureaucracy day after day after day? And you will find that if you are trying to hire good people and they find themselves in these environments where they can't get stuff done, well, guess what? They're just going to leave and find greener pastures elsewhere where their abilities are actually valued and they are trusted. So that's something that absolutely must stress. And of course, some of the stuff I'm talking to here is more about teams or organizations, but all of this stuff applies to you as an individual, whether it's mortality risk, whether it's playing the long game, and whether it's generating a better return on investment of your time. Purpose is the key variable here. But again, at the start of this episode, I talked about purpose from the perspective of the nature of work that a company does, but this purpose doesn't necessarily need to be that. I mean, EY published a report in which they found that three key motivators they found was purpose, income, and status. Now, of course, income, depending on where you are on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, could be a strong enough motivator. In fact, even for people in developed economies, it could be a strong enough motivator. I know that in my own personal experience, whenever I've hired people from, say, Southeast Asia to work for me, particularly countries like the Philippines, I have found that their work ethic has been incredibly strong. They've been very reliable. They've done great work. They've been super proactive. And that's not because these people that I'm hiring have a strong connection to the nature of work or the mission behind my company, but they have a very strong connection to their families. It's a very family-oriented culture, and it's one in which providing for one's family is numero uno. And so your purpose could potentially be just providing. It could be saving to buy a house for your family. It could be any one of these things that aren't inherently or tied to the work you do as such, or the purpose behind the work or the company, but is still enough of a motivator to get you out of bed every day and get you doing your best work. So with all of this said, it's really difficult to argue against purpose as a key motivator, and as something that is intrinsically or extrinsically linked. I think I got that wrong. To performance. So again, whatever line of work you're in, if you have purpose behind your work, if you have incentives behind your work, which would be the topic of our next episode, if you are passionate about what you do, and if what you do is aligned with your strength, much, much higher chance of success, and your performance will inevitably be much greater than what it would be if, say, I was doing work that wasn't aligned with my strengths, that I didn't find meaning in, that I wasn't really interested in, and that paid me less than what I thought I was worth. Because then I'm probably just going to be disgruntled. I'm not going to play the long game. And all of the productivity hacks in the world and the activated turmeric is not going to save me. So I published an article on this. You can find the article on my website at steveglavesky.com. It's called The Science of Purpose at Work. And you'll be able to find links to all of the studies that are referred to in this episode in the show notes for your convenience. So with that, I'm going to bring this episode of Workflow to a close, and I wish you an awesome rest of your day. Peace out.